Opening the king's diagonal, this pawn immediately contests central territory, aiming to ignite dynamic play. Preparing the Caro-Kann defense, black immediately aims to challenge white's central pawn by fianchettoing the queen's bishop. Establishing central dominance and immediately challenging black's pawn chain opens up the game with dynamic possibilities. Challenging the center directly, black prepares to shatter white's pawn structure and open lines for counterplay. Releasing central pressure immediately opens lines, so be mindful of rapid development and potential tactical skirmishes. Reclaiming central influence, black reshapes the pawn structure to liberate the bishop. Developing the bishop to an active square prepares for castling and eyes the queenside, maintaining central influence. Developing the knight to a central square now contest white's central influence. Solidifying the center and preparing for pawn advances, this move subtly aims for a queenside advantage. Developing the knight to f6 solidifies control of the d5 pawn and prepares for castling, fitting nicely into black's harmonious development. Positioning the bishop actively on f4 aims to control the central light squares and put pressure on black's queenside, potentially preparing for a kingside attack later by developing the kingside pieces. Undertaking the fianchetto on the kingside with g6 signifies a strategic intent to bolster the monarch and potentially launch a queenside counterplay, while accepting a slight long-term structural compromise by softening the light squares. Developing the knight to f3 reinforces central control and prepares for kingside castling, while also eyeing the d4 square and offering a natural defender for the king should the opponent launch an attack. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal often signals a desire to put pressure on white's kingside, a common theme in this Caro-Kann setup, while also preparing to castle. Developing the knight to d2 solidifies the e4 pawn's defense and prepares for kingside castling, creating a harmonious setup where pieces support each other without impeding development, aiming for a stable, centrally supported position. Unleashing the knight to the flank here, h5, seeks to disrupt white's well-placed bishop on f4, aiming to exchange it off and potentially gain a tempo or create attacking chances on the kingside if the bishop retreats to an awkward square. This adventurous knight sortie prioritizes piece activity and challenges white's current setup, though it does momentarily vacate the f6 square and could be met with aggressive counterplay. Recentering the bishop to a more active diagonal, this repositioning prepares for potential central pawn pushes, or simply bolsters the kingside defense while keeping options open for further development. Securing the monarch's safety is paramount, and this castling maneuver achieves that crucial objective while connecting the rooks, preparing them for potential action on central files or flanking maneuvers. Securing the kingside instantly allows white to focus on developing a more active plan, perhaps preparing for a central pawn push or aiming to exploit the slightly unhinged knight on h5. Challenging the central pawn structure with **f5 immediately injects dynamism, aiming to unbalance white's position and potentially open lines for attack, though it also creates a pawn weakness on e6 that could become a target if not properly supported. Unleashing the knight to its ultimate outpost on b3, white aims to dominate the queenside and prepare for a potential expansion with a later a4-a5. This comment focuses on the strategic intention behind the move, emphasizing knight placement and queenside control. Black's queen embarks on a rather unusual excursion, potentially setting up a kingside attack by eyeing the h2 square and preparing for potential pawn pushes. However, this queen's journey may leave the queenside a bit exposed and could become a target for white's central pieces if not carefully supported. Launching the rook to the open file signals white's intention to exert pressure along the central corridor, aiming to exploit any potential weaknesses that might arise from black's aggressive pawn push. Igniting the kingside, black aggressively challenges white's pawn structure and aims to dislodge the crucial bishop on f4. This pawn thrust immediately creates a dynamic imbalance, forcing white to consider the potential weaknesses it exposes while simultaneously opening lines for black's own forces. Reasserting its influence on the central dark squares and preparing for a potential kingside advance, White's bishop now anchors itself on a more active diagonal, eyeing the weakened pawn structure on f4. Unleashing the bishop from its protective flank, black aims to disrupt white's central pawns and potentially create attacking chances on the king side. This aggressive positioning challenges white's bishop on e3 and suggests a desire to trade off white's more active piece, simplifying the position while opening lines for black's own pieces. Consider the potential for tactics arising from this doubled bishop threat. Is white's king suddenly more exposed, or does black overextend? Shifting the bishop back to its initial square allows for a more flexible development, potentially preparing to reinforce the kingside or even participate in an eventual queenside expansion, while also anticipating black's pawn advances. A bold commitment to the center, the rook finally assumes an active role on the e-file, challenging white's control and hinting at future skirmishes. Shifting the knight to the queenside initiates a subtle repositioning, aiming to reinforce the queenside defenses and potentially redeploy to a more active square later, perhaps targeting the center or even assisting in a kingside attack by freeing up other pieces. Dissipating the bishop pair offers white a slight but persistent spatial advantage, opening lines for potential pressure along the queenside if black isn't careful to consolidate. Recapturing the bishop significantly simplifies the position, offering white a clear pawn majority on the queenside and opening the f-file for potential future action, though it also grants black an outpost on d4 for their knight. Pushing that e-pawn forward injects immediate life into the center, disrupting white's pawn structure and challenging control over the d4 square, potentially opening lines for black's rooks and bishop. Unveiling the queenside, white aims to exploit the slight overextension on the e-file and the lingering tension around black's newly placed pawns. Initiating an exchange in the center opens crucial diagonals and files, a bold commitment in this complex Caro-Kann structure where pieces are already entangled. A bold repositioning, this knight abandons the center it helped secure, seeking new influence on the queenside and preparing to challenge black's advanced pawns. Opening up the d-file now with the rook suggests a desire to contest the central open lines, potentially preparing for a pawn push or simply activating the rook's presence. Unlocking the c-file for immediate pressure, this advance boldly contests central space, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create new attacking avenues. Black seizes the initiative, challenging white's central control and opening a dynamic diagonal for the queen. Seizing the open diagonal, this capture not only recoups the pawn, but also opens up the queen into active play, directly threatening black's castled king, and simultaneously creating a fork possibility if the king moves clumsily. Relocating the monarch to the corner, a defensive maneuver, seeks to shield the king from the immediate diagonal pressure emanating from the opposing queen. This strategic repositioning, while ostensibly improving safety, implicitly concedes valuable space on the kingside and creates a potential target area for future white attacks. This aggressive maneuver on the e-file seizes a critical open file, aiming to dislodge black's beleaguered king and exploit the newly created weaknesses around it. Prepare for a potential onslaught as the white rook penetrates deeply into enemy territory. A clever defensive maneuver, seeking to untangle the queen from the immediate pressure and reposition it to a more active diagonal. A strategic repositioning is underway, aiming to galvanize the rook on the e-file, which, for now, enjoys free passage due to black's passive g6 pawn. Recognizing the tactical impossibility of capturing the knight on c1 with the bishop, black opts to contest the open c-file, a logical step in preventing white's growing influence on the queenside and potentially disrupting the otherwise harmonious coordination of white's pieces. Sacrificing the bishop for a pawn exchange strategically clears the dark squares, aiming to disrupt black's nascent kingside attack and potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure. The black queen now finds herself in a peculiar spot, a target for the rook on e6, while the white king remains quite secure behind its pawn shield. Reclaiming the open file after the exchange disrupts black's central pawn structure and creates immediate pressure along the c-file, potentially isolating the doubled c-pawns if black isn't careful. Reclaiming the captured piece with the pawn immediately solidifies the queenside pawn structure, although it surrenders the open b-file to the rook, potentially creating future attacking avenues. Recapturing on c6 with the queen finally seizes control of the open c-file, a crucial advantage after the exchange of pieces, and simultaneously pressures black's still uncastled monarch. Reasserting central influence with the queen after the exchange is a pragmatic response, aiming to dissolve white's overwhelming pawn structure and prepare for potential counterplay, though the isolated doubled pawns on the c-file present a long-term vulnerability. The queens are off the board, ushering in an endgame that's far from simple due to the pawn structure. The pawn structure is now significantly altered, opening lines for the rooks to engage, yet the material deficit for black remains a pressing concern. Shifting the monarch to f1 shores up the king's shelter, anticipating potential threats along the central files, and preparing for a more active role in the looming endgame. A thoughtful repositioning, the bishop embarks on a journey to a more active diagonal, eyeing the weakened kingside and seeking potential tactical opportunities along the open files that now define the board's center. Securing the open file with the rook is a natural impulse, but perhaps a moment to ponder the pawn structure's long-term implications. Simplifying the position is the immediate consequence, trading off remaining heavy pieces and ushering in a stark endgame where the active rook is neutralized. The sudden simplification through piece exchanges on the dark squares, particularly the bishop for the rook, fundamentally alters the pawn structure, opening up the central files and presenting a stark endgame challenge. Attempting to solidify the pawn chain and build a defensive bulwark, this maneuver gambles on creating a new outpost for the bishop, but it simultaneously exposes the kingside and neglects the crucial queenside pawn weaknesses that were so thoroughly exploited in the previous exchanges. Securing the queenside majority with a pawn advance, aiming to create a passed pawn and gain space on that flank. Focusing on king's safety now, black retreats the monarch to a seemingly more sheltered square, preparing to potentially reactivate the g-pawn, which suddenly looks a bit precarious on its current advanced position, threatening to become a target in this still dynamic, yet slowly simplifying positional struggle. Pushing the b-pawn forward now aims to gain space on the queen side, creating a potential outpost and restricting black's maneuvering capabilities for the remaining minor pieces. Prioritizing king's safety, black repositions their monarch to the corner, seeking refuge from the open files and potential threats lurking on the kingside. This maneuver also subtly prepares for potential pawn pushes on the queen side, aiming to create counterplay and disrupt white's advancing pawn structure. Unlocking the queenside's potential, ba3 aims to activate the bishop and challenge black's queenside pawn structure, potentially creating a passed pawn for white while disrupting black's coordination. A welcome retreat for the bishop, redeploying to a more active diagonal and preparing to challenge white's entrenched pieces on the queen side. Exposing the black king with a sudden royal discovery, this move sacrifices material to achieve a potentially decisive spatial advantage and disrupt black's pawn structure. Relocating the king to e6 marks a pivotal moment, aiming to solidify its position against the encroaching white bishop on a3, while simultaneously preparing to contest the vulnerable d5 pawn and potentially activate the rook on f8. The bishop vacates its post, clearing the path for the knight to solidify its newfound central dominance, potentially setting up a decisive squeeze on the kingside with the combined power of the remaining pieces. The black king, now exposed and venturing into enemy territory, immediately faces heightened danger as the white knight leaps forward, initiating a direct confrontation. Challenging the bishop's hold on the long diagonal, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's piece coordination and potentially open lines for attack. The knight's repositioning here is a subtle bid to reignite a dynamic presence on the kingside, aiming to exploit any potential weakness in white's consolidated pawn structure after the exchanges, and perhaps to contest the open file should it arise again. The rook sacrifice nets a pawn, but opens up the king to potential checks on the weakened diagonal. Asserting central control, black's knight boldly ventures onto e4, eyeing potential disruptions and aiming to exploit the now exposed white king. Exposing your king to a potential g-pawn push. This move sacrifices pawn structure for a desperate attempt to gain space on the king side, but it neglects the critical pawn weakness on the king side. The knight's unexpected lunge to d2 immediately disrupts white's pawn chain and threatens to peel off the crucial a7 bishop, potentially exposing the king further and creating significant pawn weaknesses. The monarch's repositioning towards the center, while seemingly passive, aims to activate itself as a fighting piece in the impending simplified endgame, anticipating the knight's potential checks and preparing to support the pawns. The knight's journey to c4 aims to disrupt white's consolidated queenside pawn structure and potentially exploit the open b-file, a tactical geometric maneuver that forces white to reevaluate their positional advantages. Pawns advancing to the 6th rank create a significant spatial advantage, potentially isolating the black knight and initiating a dangerous queenside push. The knight's hop to a5 signals a proactive intent to disrupt white's pawn majority on the queen side, aiming to exchange off a defender and potentially create a passed pawn of its own, or at least tie down white's pieces. Unleashing a potent passed pawn, white forces black to confront its advance, fundamentally altering the endgame's dynamic by creating a decisive race towards promotion. A desperate gambit to inject life into a dwindling position, hoping to distract from the crushing pawn majority and the exposed monarch. The monarch's journey to the center aims to rally support and potentially influence the fight over the central pawns. Initiating a pawn march down the kingside aims to create a passed pawn, but it also weakens your king's immediate vicinity and offers white attacking chances along the central files. Snatching the pawn opens a vital diagonal for the bishop, immediately putting pressure on the knight and forcing a response. Bringing the king back into the action after the long march is a sensible attempt to activate it, but this pawn structure is now quite vulnerable, and the king's presence doesn't immediately solve the issue of the advanced b-pawn. Solidifying the pawn chain becomes the priority as white aims to restrict black's knight and prepare for the inevitable pawn race. The knight's repositioning to d8 seems rather passive, a strategic retreat rather than an assertive maneuver, as it abandons the fight for central control and allows white's king to become more active in the endgame. Instigating a central pawn advance to seize more territory and activate the queenside majority becomes paramount now. The pawn chain has fractured, and the knight now dances freely into the d4 outpost, seeking to disrupt white's remaining structure and prepare for further penetration. The bishop's repositioning aims to disrupt black's unified pawn front, seeking to create weaknesses by isolating the d-pawn or forcing uncomfortable exchanges. Unleashing an aggressive pawn push to stir up the stagnant central ranks, black aims to disrupt white's meticulously constructed pawn chain and inject a much-needed dose of dynamism into the otherwise static position. Opening the h-file now seems like a desperate attempt to activate the rook, but it risks exposing the king further and gives black excellent counterplay with their advanced pawn. Opening that g-file could be a double-edged sword, potentially creating counterplay for black, but also exposing the king to further threats if not managed carefully. Unleashing the pawn on the kingside cracks open black's defense, aiming to exploit the discovered attack now that the knight is no longer guarding the g4 square. Unleashing the knight from its passive post behind the pawn chain, black seeks to disrupt white's consolidated structure and exploit the open lines that have emerged. This maneuver aims to re-engage the knight in the central action, potentially setting up tactics or improving its outpost prospects.